Picture this. It's 1987, you're sitting in a movie theater, the lights go down, the music starts, and Kevin Costner walks onto the screen as Eliot Ness, clean-cut, determined, the perfect American hero. Sean Connery plays the gruff Irish cop who teaches him the rules of the street. And then Robert De Niro walks in as Al Capone, massive, terrifying, dripping in power and violence. You're watching one of the greatest gangster movies ever made. You're watching The Untouchables. The movie tells you a story, a clear, satisfying Hollywood story. Eliot Ness and his small team of honest federal agents, the Untouchables, go up against the most powerful criminal in American history. They raid his breweries, they gather evidence, they outsmart him at every turn, and finally, after years of fighting, Eliot Ness brings Al Capone to justice. Good defeats evil, the hero wins. Roll credits. That movie won an Oscar. It made $106 million at the box office. Critics loved it. The audience loved it. 39 years later, people still watch it, still quote it, still hold it up as one of the best crime films ever made. And almost everyone who watched it walked away believing the same thing. Eliot Ness caught Al Capone. Here is the problem. That is not what happened. Not even close. Eliot Ness did not bring down Al Capone. His raids barely touched Capone's operation. Capone was making $100 million a year in 1920s money, and Ness's most dramatic raids cost him maybe $1 or $2 million in damages. That's like stealing someone's lunch money and claiming you bankrupted them. Capone barely noticed. He kept operating, he kept making money, he kept ordering murders, and Eliot Ness kept calling the newspapers to make sure they photographed his raids. The person who actually brought down Al Capone was not a gun-carrying federal agent with a square jaw and a good suit. The person who brought down Al Capone was an accountant. His name was Frank Wilson. He worked for the IRS. He had a calculator and a pile of tax records. And while Eliot Ness was posing for newspaper photographs, Frank Wilson was quietly, methodically, patiently building a case that would put America's most powerful gangster in federal prison. Let that sink in for a moment. Al Capone, the man who ran Chicago like a king, who had judges and police chiefs on his payroll, who ordered the St. Valentine's Day massacre, who made more money than most corporations, was brought down because he forgot to pay his taxes. The most feared man in America went to prison over tax evasion. Not murder, not bootlegging, not ordering hundreds of deaths. Taxes. Movie gave you the exciting version, the heroic version, the Hollywood version. I'm going to give you the documented version, the version that comes from FBI files, IRS records, court transcripts, and historical archives. I'm going to show you who Al Capone really was, where he really came from, how he really built his empire, how he really got caught, and why the movie, as great as it is, lied to you from the opening frame. This is the real Al Capone. And I promise you, the real story is more interesting than anything Hollywood invented. Before we go back to 1899, Brooklyn, do one thing for me right now. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I do this every video, and the responses genuinely blow my mind. This content reaches every corner of the world, and I want to see just how far this one travels. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now. This channel is built on one simple idea. Hollywood gives you the myth, I give you the history. This video is part of my series on separating what the movies told you from what actually happened, and every single video in this series has changed the way people think about a story they thought they already knew. Like this video right now, not at the end right now. The research into one of history's most documented criminals takes time, effort, and a lot of primary sources. That thumbs up tells YouTube this content is worth pushing to more people. And honestly, the truth about Al Capone deserves to reach as many people as possible. Here is what you are about to watch. The complete, real story of Al Capone, from poor immigrant kid in Brooklyn to the most powerful criminal in American history to broken, sick prisoner in Alcatraz. Then we will break down exactly what The Untouchables got right and what it completely invented. Every claim in this video comes from court records, FBI files, IRS documents, historical archives, and biographies by credible historians. Nothing is speculation, everything is sourced. You've seen The Untouchables. Now see the reality. Let's start in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. January 17th, 1899. A boy is born in Brooklyn, New York. His parents name him Alphonse Gabriel Capone. His mother calls him Al. The neighborhood would eventually call him something else, something he would spend the rest of his life hating. But in 1899, he is just a baby in a small apartment, the fourth child of Gabriele and Teresa Capone, Italian immigrants from Naples who came to America in 1893 looking for the thing every immigrant looks for, a better life than the one they left behind. They did not find a better life. Not exactly. They found Brooklyn. You have to understand what Brooklyn looked like in 1899 to understand what shaped Al Capone. This was not the Brooklyn of today. The trendy neighborhoods and expensive coffee shops and artists with studio apartments. This was the Brooklyn of overcrowded tenements, dirt streets, factory smoke, and the kind of poverty that sits on your chest every single morning and reminds you that the people who have money are never going to share it with you. Gabriele Capone worked as a barber. He was honest, hardworking, and he could not earn enough money to give his 9 children anything beyond survival. 9 children. Gabriele and Teresa had 9 children. Al was the 4th. His brothers would grow up to become criminals alongside him. Ralph Bottles Capone would eventually manage Al's alcohol operations. Frank Capone would die in a shootout with police at age 29. The Capone family was not predestined for crime, but they were surrounded by it, shaped by it, and offered very few exits from it. The neighborhood itself was a school for crime. Navy Street in Brooklyn was one of the rougher patches of a rough borough. Italian and Irish immigrants packed into small spaces, men working brutal hours for poverty wages, kids growing up on streets where the people with money were either corrupt cops or local criminals. You learned fast in this environment. You learned who had power and how they got it. You learned that the honest path, the factory job, the delivery route, the apprenticeship would keep you fed but never get you anything more. And you learned that the other path, the criminal path, was dangerous, but it came with money, respect, and freedom. Al Capone absorbed all of this. He was a big kid, physically large for his age, strong, not afraid of a fight. He was also smart, but not in the way that school rewards. He was not interested in books. He was interested in reading people, in understanding how power worked, in figuring out what made men respect other men. His teachers noted that he was sharp when he wanted to be. He just rarely wanted to be. He attended public school in Brooklyn starting in 1904. He was an average student at best. And then, in 1914, when Al was 14 years old, everything changed. A teacher hit him. The accounts vary on exactly what happened. Some say the teacher disciplined him. Some say he was caught doing something he shouldn't have. What is consistent across all the historical accounts is what happened next. Al hit the teacher back. He was expelled immediately. He never returned to formal education. He was 14 years old, and his path into legitimate society had just closed. Think about what that means. No high school diploma, no professional credentials, no access to the kinds of careers that required formal education. In 1914, in Brooklyn, if you were a 14-year-old Italian immigrant kid who had just been expelled from school, your options were narrow. You could work in a factory for $6 a week, which in today's money is roughly $180 a week, poverty wages by any measure. You could do deliveries, work the docks, sweep floors, or you could look at the men on the corner with the nice clothes and the money and the deference of people who should have been bigger than them, and you could ask yourself a very simple question. Why not me? Al Capone chose to ask that question, and the streets of Brooklyn had an answer ready for him. After leaving school, he took a series of odd jobs. He worked at a candy store, he worked at a bowling alley, he worked as a paper cutter in a factory. He made almost nothing. He hated it. He could see everywhere around him that honest work was a trap, a way to stay poor while pretending you had dignity. And he could see just as clearly that the men who had broken out of that trap had done it through crime, through organized crime specifically, through the gangs and syndicates that had taken over entire neighborhoods and turned poverty into power. He was 15 years old when he made his decision. The 5 Points Gang. If you want to understand what shaped Al Capone as a criminal, not just as a person, but as an operator, as a businessman of crime, you need to understand this gang and what it really was. The 5 Points Gang was based in Manhattan, named after the 5 Points neighborhood, an area of lower Manhattan that is now roughly where Chinatown sits. But by the time Al joined, the gang's influence stretched across New York, and calling it a gang almost undersells what it was. It was an organized criminal enterprise with hundreds of members, a hierarchy of leadership, defined territories, and a full menu of criminal activities, theft, extortion, prostitution, illegal gambling, loan sharking, enforcement for hire. The leader was a man named Johnny Torio. Remember that name. Write it down if you have to, because Johnny Torio is arguably the most important figure in Al Capone's life, more important than any federal agent, more important than any rival gangster. Torio was the man who taught Al Capone everything worth knowing about organized crime. And the first lesson Torio taught, the most important lesson, was one that separated him from every other gang leader of his era. Violence is a tool, not a goal. Most gang leaders of the early 20th century used violence as a solution to everything. Somebody disrespects you, kill them. Somebody doesn't pay, beat them. Territory dispute, shoot people until it's resolved. And this approach worked in the short term. But it also meant constant police attention, constant war, constant risk of being killed yourself. Torio understood something deeper. Violence was expensive. Violence attracted heat. Violence was inefficient. The real power was in money, in making so much money that you could buy protection, buy silence, buy the officials who were supposed to stop you. Bribe the police instead of fighting them. Pay the judges instead of threatening the witnesses. Make the politicians your partners instead of your enemies. Build a business, not a war machine. Al Capone sat at Johnny Torio's feet and absorbed every word. But before he got to the business lessons, he had to prove himself on the streets. Starting around 1914 and 1915, Al began working for the 5 Points Gang in the entry-level way that all young members did, running errands, acting as a lookout, doing small thefts. He graduated quickly to collection work, going to people who owed money and making sure they paid, then to enforcement, protecting the gang's territory, dealing with rivals, sending messages with fists and threats. He was good at it. He was physically imposing, he was fearless in a way that was almost unsettling, and he was loyal. In a world where loyalty was everything, Al Capone was reliably, completely loyal. Johnny Torio noticed him, and Torio, who had an eye for talent the way a great coach has an eye for athletes, took Al under his wing. In 1917, Torio gave Al a real job. He put him to work at a place called the Harvard Inn, a bar and brothel in Coney Island, Brooklyn, that Torio owned. Al was 18 years old. His job was bartender and bouncer. He managed the floor, he kept the peace, he collected money, and he learned how an illegal business operation actually ran from the ground up. What came in, what went out, who got paid, how the protection arrangements worked. He was, in the most literal sense, getting his MBA from the organized crime school of Brooklyn. Then came the incident that would follow him for the rest of his life. One evening at the Harvard Inn, Al made a crude remark to a young woman, a comment about her appearance or her body. The exact words are lost to history, but the nature of it is not. The woman's brother was present. His name was Frank Galluccio, and unlike many people who might have swallowed the insult and moved on, Galluccio pulled a knife. He slashed Al's face 3 times, once across the left cheek, twice across the jaw, 3 permanent scars, the kind of scars that define a face. This gave Al Capone his famous nickname, Scarface. He hated it. This cannot be overstated. Al Capone despised that nickname with an intensity that his associates learned to respect by never using it in his presence. He went to extraordinary lengths to hide the scars in photographs, always positioning himself to show his right side, the unscarred side, to the camera. In the rare photographs where the scars are visible, you can sometimes see the tension in his jaw that comes from knowing they are showing. He would tell people who asked about them that he got the scars in the war. He had never served a single day in the military. But here is what the Harvard Inn incident actually taught him, beyond the obvious physical lesson. It taught him to be more careful about who he insulted. It taught him that his mouth could make enemies he didn't need to make. And it planted in him an early seed of what would become one of his defining characteristics, an obsessive concern with his public image. Al Capone, from the moment those scars appeared on his face, was always performing for an audience. He just shifted which audience mattered. In December 1918, a young Irish-American woman from Brooklyn became relevant to Al Capone's life in a way that would surprise many people who thought they knew his story. Her name was Mary Coughlin, May. Everyone called her. Al had been seeing her, and in December of 1918, she became pregnant. Their son was born on December 4th, 1918. They named him Albert Francis Capone, Sonny, to his family. And on December 30th, 1918, 3 weeks after his son's birth, Al Capone married May Coughlin in a Catholic ceremony. He did not have to marry her. By the standards of criminal culture in 1918, Brooklyn, an unwanted pregnancy did not obligate a man to anything. But Al Capone was, underneath everything, a Catholic man who took family with complete seriousness. He loved his wife. He was devoted to his son. For the rest of his life, regardless of everything else he was doing, regardless of the murders he ordered and the businesses he ran and the corruption he spread, he kept a completely different self reserved for his family. He was a faithful husband by the standards of a man who ran brothels. He was a devoted father in a way that everyone who knew him confirmed. This contradiction is one of the most important things to understand about Al Capone. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a human being who had made choices, terrible choices. Choices that got people killed, but a human being nonetheless. He could order a murder in the morning and sit down to dinner with his family that evening and be genuinely, completely present for both. The ability to compartmentalize is not exclusive to gangsters, but in Al Capone it was so complete that it shaped everything. By 1919, Al Capone was 20 years old and facing a problem. The exact nature of the problem varies depending on which account you read. Some historians say he killed a man in a fight. Others say it was a serious altercation that attracted police attention. Others say it was pressure from a rival gang. What all the accounts agree on is the result. Al needed to leave New York. He needed a fresh start somewhere the consequences of his actions wouldn't catch up with him. And as it happened, his mentor, his teacher, the man who had shaped his entire criminal education, Johnny Torio, had already left New York. Torio had moved to Chicago years earlier in 1909 and had gone to work for a man named Big Jim Colosimo, Chicago's dominant crime boss. Torio had built a small empire under Colosimo's protection, gambling, prostitution, and extortion. And when Al needed to disappear from Brooklyn in 1920, Torio sent word, "Come to Chicago, work for me, fresh start." Al Capone packed up May and Sonny and got on a train heading west. He arrived in Chicago in 1920. And what he found there was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way that word is usually used, not beautiful, not inspiring. Extraordinary in the way that a man who had grown up on the margins of everything would find extraordinary. Extraordinary opportunity. Chicago in 1920 was a city of 2.7 million people. America's second largest city, a roaring, industrial, muscular city built on meatpacking and steel and railroads and the endless flow of goods across the American heartland. It was wealthy, it was enormous, and it was, by virtually every account from the period, the most corrupt city in the United States. Not corrupt in the subtle, deniable way that corruption usually works. The kind of corruption where everyone suspects it, but no one can prove it. This was corruption on open display. The mayor, the aldermen, the police captains, the judges, they took bribes openly, casually, as a matter of course. The police did not try to hide the fact that they worked for the highest bidder. Politicians did not pretend that their decisions were anything other than financial transactions. The entire civic machinery of Chicago had been converted over decades into a revenue stream for whoever could afford to use it. For a young criminal arriving from Brooklyn with nothing but ambition and talent, this was not a warning. This was an invitation. And then came Prohibition. I need to stop here and explain Prohibition properly, because without understanding Prohibition, nothing that follows makes any sense. Everything Al Capone became, everything he built, everything that happened, all of it flows directly from this one law. So bear with me for a few minutes because this context is everything. On January 17th, 1920, the same day Al Capone turned 21 years old, as fate would have it, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect. This amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol throughout the entire United States. No more beer, no more whiskey, no more wine, no more bars, no more breweries, no more distilleries. Illegal. All of it. Everywhere. Effective immediately. The people who pushed for Prohibition had been fighting for this for decades. They were mostly religious reformers and social activists, and they genuinely believed that alcohol was the root cause of poverty, domestic violence, broken families, and social disorder. Their argument was not entirely wrong. Alcohol abuse was a real problem in early 20th century America, and the harm it caused was real and documented. Their solution, however, was one of the most catastrophic policy failures in American history. Because they made one enormous miscalculation. They assumed that if you banned alcohol, people would stop drinking. Americans did not stop drinking. Millions of Americans simply decided that they preferred to break the law rather than be sober. And the moment that became clear, which was approximately the first weekend of Prohibition, a market appeared. A massive, urgent, illegal market for alcohol with more customers than any business in the country and no competition from legal suppliers because legal suppliers had just been outlawed. Think about what this means economically. Before Prohibition, a glass of beer at a legal bar cost about 5 cents. It was cheap because it was legal, taxed, and produced in regulated quantities by established breweries. The moment Prohibition hit, the legal breweries shut down. But the demand didn't go anywhere. All those millions of Americans who wanted a drink on Friday night still wanted a drink on Friday night. They were just going to have to get it from someone operating outside the law. And operating outside the law meant no taxes, no regulations, no price controls, no competition from legal business. A glass of that same beer, made in an illegal brewery, transported by illegal bootleggers, sold in an illegal bar called a speakeasy, now costs 25 cents. Sometimes more. A 5-cent product had become a 25-cent product overnight. That's a 400% markup, and the volume was enormous. We are talking about millions of customers every single day across every American city. The potential profits were almost incomprehensible, and the criminals who understood this first and moved fastest were going to become the wealthiest people in America. Not the wealthiest criminals in America. The wealthiest people in America, period. Johnny Torio understood this the moment the law passed. His boss, Big Jim Colosimo, did not. Colosimo was already wealthy from gambling and prostitution. He was comfortable. He looked at the bootlegging opportunity and said, essentially, why take the risk? We're already making enough money. Let someone else handle the alcohol. Torio disagreed passionately. This wasn't a side business opportunity. This was the biggest criminal opportunity in American history. This was the chance to turn a successful criminal operation into something that dwarfed every previous conception of what criminal wealth could look like. But Colosimo refused to be moved. On May 11th, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in the lobby of his own restaurant. The killer was never officially identified. The murder was never officially solved. Historical consensus points strongly to Johnny Torio as the man who ordered it. Some accounts suggest Al Capone may have been involved in the execution. This is not proven to the standard of court evidence, and honest historians present it as likely but not certain. What is certain is the result. Johnny Torio became the new boss of Chicago's biggest criminal organization, and Al Capone became his right-hand man. Torio set Al to work immediately. He made him the manager of a place called the Four Deuces, 2222 South Wabash Avenue, a 4-story building that functioned simultaneously as a saloon on the ground floor, a gambling den on the 2nd floor, a brothel on the 3rd floor, and Torio's office on the 4th. Al was 21 years old, managing an illegal operation that was already making him more money than he had ever seen. His salary was around $25,000 a year, the equivalent of roughly $400,000 today. He was 21 years old. But this was just the beginning, because Prohibition was about to turn everything Al Capone was learning into something much, much larger. The business model Torio built, and that Al Capone would inherit and expand, worked in 4 steps. First, get the alcohol. This meant smuggling it from Canada across the Great Lakes, producing it in secret breweries hidden in Chicago's industrial neighborhoods and suburbs, or buying it wholesale from smaller independent bootleggers. Second, protect the operation. This meant bribing police, $100 to $500 per week per precinct, paid reliably, never missed. It meant paying politicians on a regular schedule, ensuring that the laws that existed on paper would never be enforced in practice. It meant paying judges to dismiss cases when arrests happened, despite everything. Third, distribute to speakeasies. Chicago had thousands of illegal bars. Estimates suggest 10,000 or more in the greater Chicago area. Torio's organization supplied most of them with alcohol, taking a cut of their revenue and charging for protection. Fourth, eliminate competition. Any rival gang that tried to claim territory was dealt with either through negotiation, Torio's preferred method, dividing the city into agreed territories, or through violence when negotiation failed. By 1922, Al Capone was a millionaire. By 1923, he was one of the most important figures in Chicago's criminal hierarchy, not yet at the top, but clearly and unmistakably ascending. He was 24 years old. He had arrived from Brooklyn with nothing. The city of Chicago, combined with the gift that the United States government had accidentally given to criminals everywhere, had turned him into something that no one in his family could have imagined when Gabriele and Teresa Capone made the crossing from Naples in 1893. But the real power was still to come, and it would arrive in circumstances that Torio himself could not have predicted. Chicago in the early 1920s was not one criminal organization. It was several, divided by ethnicity, geography, and the particular histories that brought them all to the same city at the same time, looking for the same thing. Torio's organization was Italian, based on the South Side. The North Side belonged to a different gang entirely, Irish and Polish, led by a man named Dean O'Banion, who ran his criminal operation out of a flower shop that he genuinely owned and genuinely loved. There were others scattered across the West Side and in various suburbs, and all of them wanted the same thing: control of Chicago's bootlegging routes, the most profitable criminal enterprise the world had yet seen. For a while, Torio managed this through negotiation. He was brilliant at it. He could sit across a table from men who hated each other and find the arrangement that gave everyone enough money to stay satisfied. The city was divided into territories. Each gang controlled its patch. Everyone got rich. Nobody had to die. It was, in its way, an elegant solution, but it didn't last. Dean O'Banion was a problem. Not because he was violent, though he was, but because he was unpredictable. He didn't play by the rules of the arrangement when it suited him not to. He sold Torio a brewery that he knew was about to be raided by federal agents, pocketing $500,000 and leaving Torio to face arrest. He mocked the Italian gangs. He made enemies carelessly, with the confidence of a man who believed that his territory and his reputation protected him from consequences. He was wrong. On November 10th, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's flower shop on North State Street. They shook his hand, a customary greeting in the gangster world, a gesture that meant you were coming in peace. Then they shot him 6 times. He died on the floor of his own flower shop, surrounded by flowers he had been tending minutes before. The killers walked out. Nobody was ever charged. The historical record strongly indicates that the order came from Torio, with Capone's agreement. The men who pulled the triggers were brought in from outside Chicago specifically to keep the trail cold. In this sense, O'Banion's murder demonstrated something that Al Capone would apply extensively in his own career: the use of outside killers for important jobs, men who had no visible connection to the people ordering the hit, making prosecution essentially impossible. But the murder also had a consequence that Torio had miscalculated. O'Banion's North Side gang did not collapse without its leader. It regrouped, found a new leader in a man named Jaime Weiss, and came back looking for revenge. They found it on January 24th, 1925. Johnny Torio was returning to his apartment building at 7011 South Clyde Avenue when 2 men who had been waiting in a parked car stepped out and started shooting. Torio was hit 5 times, in the jaw, the neck, the chest, the arm, the groin. He survived, barely, through a combination of luck and the fact that his wife was present and screamed at the attackers, causing them to hesitate at the moment they might have finished the job. Torio spent weeks in the hospital, and when he finally recovered, he made a decision that was either the most sensible thing a criminal boss ever did, or the most cowardly, depending on your perspective. He decided he was done. He was 43 years old. He had been in the crime business for decades. He had more money than he could spend. He had just been shot 5 times outside his own home. The bootlegging empire was worth hundreds of millions, but what good was any of it if you were dead? Torio arranged a brief prison term on a prohibition violation, served it, and then used it as cover to announce his retirement. He handed the entire operation to Al Capone. Al Capone was 25 years old. Let that settle for a moment. 25 years old, and he had just inherited control of an organization making $50 million a year in legal revenue, not earning a salary from it, controlling it, running it, the entire apparatus, the breweries, the speakeasies, the gambling operations, the brothels, the police bribes, the political connections, everything was now his. This was not a gradual assumption of power. This was not a long campaign to climb the ladder. Torio handed it to him directly because he trusted Al Capone's intelligence and capability in a way that he trusted almost no one else. that trust would be proven correct. What Al Capone built over the next 6 years was something that the United States government, in its official records, would eventually describe as the largest criminal organization in American history to that point. The first thing you notice about Al Capone as a criminal boss is how different he was from his mentor. Torio was invisible. Torio kept quiet, stayed out of newspapers, avoided the spotlight with the obsessive care of a man who understood that publicity was a weapon turned against you. Al Capone was the complete opposite. Al wanted to be seen. He wore custom-made suits that cost $5,000 each. In 1920s money, an extraordinary sum, more than most working-class families earned in a year. He drove an armored Cadillac that weighed 7 tons and had been fitted with bulletproof glass and steel plating at a cost that exceeded what most people paid for their houses. He took over the 4th floor of the Lexington Hotel on South Michigan Avenue and made it his headquarters, his court, his throne room, a place where politicians and businessmen and judges and police chiefs came to him, not the other way around. He attended baseball games publicly. He was photographed everywhere. He gave interviews to newspapers in which he described himself as a businessman who simply gave the public what it wanted. "I am just a businessman," he would say. "I give the people what they want. What's wrong with that?" It was, as a piece of public relations, genuinely sophisticated. He was framing his criminal empire as a service industry, positioning himself as the man who kept Chicago supplied with the entertainment its citizens wanted while the government kept trying to take it away from them. And remarkably, infuriatingly to his enemies, it worked. Many Chicagoans genuinely liked Al Capone. He employed thousands of people. He ran soup kitchens during the Depression. He was famous, and in America, fame creates its own kind of legitimacy. But behind the flash and the public performance was something much more serious. A business. A genuinely extraordinary criminal business. The bootlegging operation alone generated roughly $60 million a year in revenue. Think about how that worked in practical terms. Al Capone's organization controlled the production, transportation, and wholesale distribution of illegal alcohol across Chicago and its suburbs. They ran breweries, real industrial operations, hidden in warehouses and buildings that looked from the outside like legitimate businesses. They had fleets of trucks, delivery routes, salesmen who called on speakeasy owners the way legitimate salespeople called on restaurant owners. They had quality control, they had pricing structures, they had contracts of a kind. The whole thing ran like a real company, except that the product was illegal, the contracts were enforced by violence, and the profits went untaxed into the pockets of Al Capone and his associates. On top of the bootlegging, the gambling operations brought in $25 million a year. Capone's organization ran casinos, dice games, and horse racing betting operations across Chicago and particularly in Cicero, a suburb that Capone had effectively converted into his own private municipality. The story of how he took over Cicero in 1924 is almost impossible to believe unless you understand what Chicago area politics actually looked like in the 1920s. Capone's men physically stood outside polling places on election day, intimidating voters, beating up candidate supporters, and in some cases, simply counting the ballots the way they wanted them counted. His candidate won. The Cicero police chief went on Capone's payroll. Every gambling house, every speakeasy, every brothel in Cicero operated under Capone's protection and paid him a percentage. He was not, technically speaking, the mayor of Cicero. But the mayor of Cicero did exactly what Al Capone told him to do. The prostitution operations added another $10 million a year. The labor racketeering, controlling unions, and using that control to extort businesses added another $10 million. All told, Al Capone's organization was generating revenues of roughly $100 million per year. In today's money, accounting for inflation and the purchasing power of the 1920s dollar, we are talking about something between $1.5 and $2 billion annually. He was, by any measure, one of the wealthiest men in America. He was 26, 27, 28 years old. The corruption that sustained this empire was equally staggering in its scale. Al Capone paid approximately $30 million per year in bribes to Chicago police, $30 million every year, to ensure that the men whose job was to stop him would look the other way. He had city aldermen on his payroll, state legislators, and judges who ensured that the rare arrest would result in a dismissed case. He had a relationship with Chicago's mayor, Big Bill Thompson, that was less a bribe than a business partnership. Thompson's political machine and Capone's criminal machine operated in such close parallel that separating them in the historical record is sometimes nearly impossible. This is what the movie shows you in outline, and in this broad sense, the corruption, the scale of the operation, the impunity with which Capone operated in Chicago. The Untouchables got it essentially right. What it got wrong was everything about who stopped it. It would be dishonest to spend this much time on Al Capone's wealth and business acumen without spending equal time on the violence that made all of it possible. Because the money and the corruption were the superstructure, and the violence was the foundation. Every agreement held, ultimately, because the people who broke agreements ended up dead. Every rival who encroached on territory found their operations bombed or their associates shot. Every witness who considered cooperating with law enforcement had a very clear understanding of what cooperation could cost them. During Prohibition in Chicago, the years between 1920 and 1933, there were over 500 gangland murders. 500 in 13 years. That is an average of more than one mob killing per week, every week, for over a decade. Of those 500, historical estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 were directly connected to Capone's organization, either ordered by Capone himself, carried out by his men, or conducted by associates working on his behalf. Al Capone personally killing people is a harder question to answer. The accounts are numerous and colorful. There are stories of Capone beating men to death with a baseball bat, accounts that have been repeated so many times they have acquired the feel of established fact. But the honest answer, the answer that the historical and evidentiary record actually supports, is we cannot definitively prove that Al Capone personally killed anyone. He was careful. He used other people. He had, in the person of Machine Gun Jack McGurn, one of the most effective and prolific hitmen of the Prohibition era. A man who could be relied upon to handle the physical execution of orders while keeping the chain of command clean enough to be deniable. McGurn's real name was Vincenzo Gibaldi. He was a Sicilian-American from Brooklyn who had taken the name Jack McGurn after his stepfather was murdered by the mob, and who had entered Capone's organization initially driven by revenge, and then stayed because he was exceptionally talented at what they needed him to do. McGurn was responsible for dozens of murders and was the key planner of what became the most infamous event of the entire Prohibition era. An event so dramatic, so violent, so shocking, even by the standards of 1920s Chicago, that it finally convinced the federal government that Al Capone could not be allowed to continue. February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, Chicago's North Side. The North Side Gang had been Al Capone's most persistent problem since the murder of Dean O'Banion in 1924. Under successive leaders, Jaime Weiss, then Bugs Moran, they had survived everything Capone threw at them. They had shot Torio 5 times. They had made multiple attempts on Capone's life. They had refused to accept the territorial arrangements that Capone offered. And Bugs Moran, the gang's current leader, had been openly insulting Capone in the newspapers, calling him names, mocking his Italian heritage, predicting his downfall. Capone had had enough. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Someone, the historical record strongly suggests McGurn, working with associates, sent word to the North Side Gang that there was a shipment of hijacked whiskey arriving on the morning of February 14th at a warehouse at 2122 North Clark Street, the SMC Cartage Company. Good whiskey, available cheap, needed to move quickly. Moran was told to send men to receive the delivery. 7 men gathered at the warehouse that morning. 5 of them were North Side Gang members. 1 was a mechanic who worked on the gang's cars. 1 was an optician who had the terrible misfortune of being friendly with gang members and showing up at the wrong time. They were waiting for the delivery when, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, the door opened and 4 men walked in. 2 of them were dressed as Chicago police officers, complete with uniforms. The other 2 were in civilian clothes. To the 7 men in the warehouse, this looked like a police raid. They had been through police raids before. You lined up against the wall, you waited for the booking, and then Capone's lawyers got you out. Nobody panicked, nobody ran. They did exactly what they were supposed to do during a police raid. They complied. They turned and lined up against the wall with their hands raised. Then the men who had walked in opened up with Thompson's submachine guns. Over 100 rounds were fired into that warehouse in less than a minute. 6 men died on the warehouse floor. A 7th, Frank Gusenberg, a North Side Gang member, was somehow still alive when actual police arrived, shot 14 times but breathing. A detective asked him who had done it. "Nobody shot me," Gusenberg said. He died 3 hours later without saying another word. The target, Bugs Moran himself, had been walking toward the warehouse that morning when he saw the police cars outside. Assuming it was a real raid, he had turned and walked away. He was alive. All 7 of his men were dead, and when reporters asked Moran who he thought was responsible, his answer was immediate. Only Capone kills like that. Was Al Capone responsible? Almost certainly yes. The historical evidence, including subsequent FBI investigations, the pattern of planning, and the known involvement of Jack McGurn and other Capone associates, points clearly and consistently to an operation ordered by Capone and planned by McGurn. Capone himself was in Florida at the time, a deliberate alibi. His personal distance from the physical act was always maintained. It was a fundamental principle of how he operated. No one was ever convicted for the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Not then, not ever. It remains, officially, an unsolved crime. But the photographs that newspapers published, 7 bodies slumped against a brick wall, blood everywhere, the casual obscenity of that much death in that small space. Those photographs traveled across America and changed the conversation. The public, which had been vaguely tolerant of Chicago's gang wars as long as only criminals were dying, suddenly confronted what those gang wars actually looked like up close. Congress began asking questions. President Herbert Hoover received briefings, and somewhere in the Treasury Department, a decision was made that would eventually put Al Capone in Alcatraz. This is the part of the story where we have to be careful, because Elliot Ness is a complicated figure, not because he was a bad person, not because he was corrupt or dishonest in any obviously disqualifying way, but because the legend that was built around him, first in his own memoir, then in the television series, then in Brian De Palma's movie, bears so little resemblance to what the historical record actually shows that it constitutes, in effect, a fraud on history. Eliot Ness was born in Chicago on April 19, 1903. He was a smart kid from a solid middle-class background. His parents owned a bakery. He went to the University of Chicago, where he studied economics and political science. He graduated in 1925 and went to work briefly at a credit investigation agency doing background checks and fraud investigations. It was, in retrospect, a peculiarly perfect preparation for the kind of methodical, evidence-gathering work that federal investigations require. And in 1926, at age 23, he joined the Prohibition Bureau as a federal agent. The Prohibition Bureau. This is an institution worth pausing on, because understanding what the Prohibition Bureau actually was illuminates everything about what Eliot Ness was and was not capable of accomplishing. The Prohibition Bureau was, by virtually any measure, one of the most dysfunctional federal agencies in American history. It was massively underfunded, never enough agents, never enough money, never adequate training for the agents it did have. The pay was so low that honest agents were perpetually tempted by the enormous sums being offered by the organizations they were supposed to be fighting. And most agents, not all, but most, had accepted this reality. They took the bribes, they looked the other way. They arrested small-time operators to fill their quotas while leaving the large organizations that were actually paying them untouched. Eliot Ness was different. He genuinely did not take bribes. In a bureau where corruption was the norm rather than the exception, Ness's honesty made him stand out in a way that both protected him and limited him. It protected him because it meant he was trusted with sensitive assignments. It limited him because it meant he could never operate in the gray zones where the most effective law enforcement work of the era actually happened. From 1926 to 1929, Ness worked as a regular Prohibition agent in Chicago, raiding speakeasies, arresting small-time bootleggers, building the routine experience of a working federal agent. He was competent, he was energetic, he made cases that held up in court, which was more than many of his colleagues managed, but he was not yet targeting Al Capone. He was doing the day-to-day work of Prohibition enforcement, which in practice meant chasing the small fish while the big fish swam past untouched. After the St. Valentine's Day massacre changed the political temperature around Capone, the Treasury Department decided to create a special unit whose specific mission was to disrupt Capone's bootlegging operations. Ness was chosen to lead it. He was 26 years old. Why Ness? His honest reputation was the primary factor. In a city where law enforcement was thoroughly compromised, Finding a Prohibition agent who couldn't be bought was itself a remarkable discovery. He was also young and aggressive enough to take on the kind of visible, high-profile raiding operations that the Treasury Department wanted to publicize. He was, in other words, good television before television existed. He was good newspaper copy. Ness spent the next several months carefully selecting the team that would work with him. He claims, and this is from his own memoir, so it should be treated with appropriate skepticism, that he researched every available agent and selected only those with spotless records, no financial irregularities, no known connections to criminal organizations. The team he assembled numbered somewhere between 9 and 11 agents, depending on which account you read. They were young, mostly. They were honest. And their honesty in the Chicago of 1930 was unusual enough that the newspapers gave them a name, the Untouchables, because they could not be touched by the bribes that touched everyone else. It's a good name. It's a great name. It made for a compelling story. It also obscured the fact that being untouchable wasn't the same as being effective. Between 1930 and 1931, Eliot Ness and the Untouchables conducted raids on Al Capone's bootlegging operations. This is a historical fact. The raids happened, the records exist, the newspaper accounts are numerous, and Ness was, by all accounts, personally brave during these operations. He was the kind of leader who went first through the door, who didn't ask his team to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. The question is not whether the raids happened. The question is what they accomplished. Ness's approach was methodical in its way. His team would gather intelligence on a brewery location, using informants, surveillance, following trucks, tracing supply chains. They would obtain federal warrants. Then they would conduct the raid with force, using equipment like armored trucks, which Ness reportedly specifically requisitioned as props that would photograph well to crash through the brewery doors. Once inside, they would destroy the equipment, the vats, the barrels, the bottling machinery, the brewing apparatus. They would arrest whatever workers were present and seize whatever trucks they could find. In the period from roughly mid-1930 through mid-1931, Ness conducted approximately 20 such raids. He destroyed real equipment, he arrested real workers, he made real cases. In his memoir and in his subsequent public accounts, he claimed that these raids cost Capone's organization approximately $1 million in equipment losses and impacted Capone's ability to produce and distribute alcohol. He was right about this. The raids did cost Capone money. They did disrupt specific operations in specific locations for specific periods of time. They were not nothing. But here is the mathematics that Ness's memoir and the Untouchables movie would very much prefer you not do. Al Capone's organization was generating $100 million per year in total revenue. $1 million in equipment losses, and this is Ness's own estimate, which historians generally accept as approximately correct, represents 1% of annual income. 1%. You cannot describe the loss of 1% of annual revenue as a serious disruption to a business operation. You would need to lose somewhere between 20 and 30% of revenue before the impact would genuinely threaten the business. Capone's reaction to the Ness raids, as reported by multiple associates and reconstructed from the historical record, was remarkably revealing in its casualness. He replaced the destroyed equipment, he found new locations, he continued operating, he continued making money. Ness raided a brewery on Tuesday, and by Thursday it had been moved to a new location and was running again. The whole thing was, from Capone's perspective, like a very annoying property tax. An ongoing cost of business that never threatened the business itself. There is also the question of the publicity. This is where Ness distinguished himself most clearly from a purely operational perspective, and also where the historical assessment of him gets most complicated. Ness called newspapers before his raids. He wanted photographers present. He wanted the images, the smashed vats, the destroyed equipment, the armored truck crashing through the door to appear on the front page of the Chicago Tribune the next morning. And they did, regularly. Ness's raids were some of the best photographed law enforcement operations in American history. This was effective public relations. It was good for Ness's career. It was good for the Treasury Department's public image during a period when the government desperately needed to be seen as doing something about Capone. It was good for the newspapers, and it created a narrative brave federal agents fighting the mob, chipping away at Capone's empire one brewery at a time that was compelling and satisfying and completely misleading about the actual threat facing Capone. Did Capone ever try to kill Ness? The movie shows multiple assassination attempts, hired killers, car chases, danger at every turn. The historical record shows possibly one unconfirmed incident where someone may have been hired to approach Ness about his safety. The overwhelming evidence from Capone's behavior during this period is that he did not consider Ness worth killing. Killing a federal agent would bring the full weight of the Justice Department down on his organization. And killing this particular federal agent, one who, as Capone correctly assessed, was doing minimal damage, would be pointlessly provocative. Ness was an annoyance. You don't kill people who are merely annoying you when the downside risk is catastrophic. The real threat to Al Capone was not a man raiding breweries. The real threat was a quiet, methodical, almost entirely unglamorous investigation happening in a different part of the federal government. An investigation that Capone didn't even know was happening until it was too late. Elmer Ire ran the intelligence unit of the Internal Revenue Service. He was not the kind of figure who appeared in newspaper photographs. He did not have a compelling nickname. He did not crash through doors with armored trucks. He was a bureaucrat, in the deepest, most accurate sense of that word, a man who understood federal law and financial investigation with a precision and depth that most people in law enforcement at the time didn't even know was applicable to criminal cases. Ire's insight was simple. It was also, once you understood it, obviously correct. Al Capone was making enormous amounts of money. This was not a secret. It was visible in every suit he wore, every car he drove, every hotel suite he occupied. He made enormous amounts of money, and he paid no taxes on any of it. Not because he had found some clever tax shelter or legal mechanism for sheltering income, but because he had simply never filed a tax return. He had never told the United States government that he had any income at all. As far as the IRS was concerned, Al Capone was a man with no income. This was not a clever strategy. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential mistakes of his life. A sophisticated criminal with good legal advice would have found ways to legitimize at least some of his income, to run it through shell corporations, legitimate businesses, investments that would create a paper trail that made the money look clean. Capone never did this. He operated in cash, he kept minimal written records, and he apparently believed that the corruption he had purchased so thoroughly in Chicago's police and courts would extend to the federal government indefinitely. It did not. Ire understood something that Capone didn't. The federal government doesn't need to prove murder to convict someone of tax evasion. They don't need witnesses who will testify about crimes that witnesses are afraid to discuss. They don't need to solve the mystery of who ordered what killing. All they need is documentary evidence of income and documentary evidence that taxes on that income were not paid. Those are accounting questions. They are answerable with records, receipts, bank statements, betting slips, purchase records. They are answerable with the kind of patient, methodical, financial investigation that takes years and produces results that hold up in any federal court in the country. Ire assigned an agent named Frank Wilson to lead the investigation. Frank Wilson is the person this story should be about. He is the person who should be as famous as Eliot Ness. More famous, in fact, because he is the person who actually did the work. He is the name that should be on the movie poster, but he is not famous. He did not write a memoir. He did not court publicity. He was an accountant who did his job with extraordinary skill and dedication and then returned to doing his job while a publicity-seeking Prohibition agent got the credit in the newspaper. Frank Wilson's investigation began in earnest in 1929 and continued for 2 years. His method was exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. He obtained every financial record he could find that touched Al Capone's world. Betting records from racetracks, hotel bills, suit receipts, real estate records, furniture invoices, car purchase documents. He reconstructed from thousands of fragments a picture of Al Capone's spending that made his income undeniable. Here was a man who purchased a mansion in Florida for $40,000. A massive sum in the late 1920s. Here was a man who spent thousands on custom suits. Here was a man who bet thousands at horse racing tracks, with records that existed in the form of betting slips, some of which Wilson tracked down through enormous effort. Here was a man who was clearly, demonstrably, provably living the financial life of someone with millions of dollars of income. And here was a man who had filed exactly 0 income tax returns. The key breakthrough came through a cashier named Fred Reese, who had worked for Capone Associates and had kept gambling records that Wilson found in the course of his investigation. Those records showed direct financial transactions that could be connected to Capone's income, real numbers, real transactions, the kind of concrete documentary evidence that makes a tax evasion case. Wilson later wrote in reports that have been preserved in government archives that there were moments during the investigation when he genuinely believed that someone was going to kill him before it was finished. He found evidence that Capone's organization was aware of the investigation and was attempting to locate and destroy records. At one point, he spent a year reviewing $5 million worth of financial transactions, working alone in a locked room, going through ledger after ledger looking for the thread that would tie everything together. He found it. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Al Capone on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion, covering the years 1925 through 1929. The amounts were specific, documented, and proven, back taxes owed in excess of $215,000, plus penalties, plus interest. The potential sentence, if convicted on all counts, was decades in federal prison. The most powerful gangster in American history had been brought down, not by a team of brave federal agents with guns, not by raids and shootouts and dramatic confrontations, but by an IRS accountant with 2 years of financial records and a clear understanding of Section 26 of the United States Code. Eliot Ness had nothing to do with the tax evasion case. He was not involved in the investigation. He did not gather the evidence. He did not contribute to the prosecution. He was not a witness. His name does not appear as a significant figure in the trial record. The movie's central premise that Ness brought Capone down is, in the strict historical sense, simply false. Al Capone walked into federal court in Chicago in October 1931 with what he believed was a plan. He had operated for over a decade in a city where the plan was always the same and the plan always worked. Find the person who needs to be paid and pay them. Find the person who needs to be threatened and threaten them. The levers of power, money, and violence had never failed him. He saw no reason they would fail him now. His lawyers had already explored a plea deal. The offer was this: Capone would plead guilty to reduced charges and accept a sentence of 2 to 3 years in prison. He could live with 2 or 3 years. He would serve his time, his organization would continue operating under the management of Frank Nitti, and he would return to the life he had built. 2 or 3 years was the cost of doing business, not the end of anything. Federal prosecutors rejected the deal. They rejected it flatly on the direct instructions of the United States Attorney, George E.Q. Johnson, who had been told also directly by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who had been told by President Hoover that the federal government was not interested in a deal. The federal government wanted a conviction and a sentence that would remove Al Capone from the American criminal landscape for a meaningful period of time. This left Capone with option 2. He had done this before, identified the jury, sent representatives to approach jurors with either money or fear, and arrived at trial knowing the outcome in advance. His organization was efficient at this. They obtained the list of jurors. They began making approaches. Judge James Wilkerson knew what was happening. He had been following the case closely, and he understood Capone's methods with an intimacy that came from years on the federal bench in Chicago. And on the morning the trial was scheduled to begin, in an act of judicial improvisation that was either brilliant or maddening, depending on your position, Wilkerson announced that he was exchanging his entire jury pool for the jury pool of another judge whose trial had just ended. The replacement jury sat down in the Capone trial. They had not been approached. They had no idea when they took their seats whose trial they were judging. By the time they understood the situation, it was too late for Capone's people to do anything about it. The mechanism that had worked for him in Chicago's corrupt courts for a decade had been neutralized by a single judge's decision to switch 2 rooms worth of people on a Tuesday morning. Al Capone reportedly went visibly pale when he realized what had happened. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was facing a process that he could not control. The prosecution's case was methodical and cumulative in the way that tax cases always are. George E.Q. Johnson did not try to make it dramatic. He did not need to. The evidence spoke in the dry, irrefutable language of numbers. Capone had purchased a mansion in Florida. He had bought expensive suits by the armload for thousands of dollars each. He had bet enormous sums at horse racing tracks with records showing individual bets of hundreds and thousands of dollars. He had lived in expensive hotels. He had traveled in armored luxury. And in the years that all of this spending occurred, 1925, 1926, 1927, 1928, 1929, he had filed no income tax return. He had paid no income taxes. He had reported to the United States government, in the formal sense, that he did not exist as an income-earning person. Johnson asked the jury a question that required no legal training to answer. Can a man who lives like this have no income? Can a man who spends like this owe nothing in taxes? These are not trick questions. These are questions that the simplest understanding of how money works answers immediately. Capone's defense tried several approaches. They argued that his income came primarily from gambling winnings, which, at the time, occupied a legal gray area regarding taxability. They argued that he didn't know he was required to pay taxes. They argued various technical points about what constituted taxable income. None of it was convincing. The jury had not been bought, the judge had not been bought, and the evidence, Frank Wilson's 2 years of patient, careful, exhaustive investigation, was not the kind of evidence that dissolves under cross-examination. On October 17, 1931, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty, on 5 counts of tax evasion. Al Capone, according to everyone who was present in the courtroom, went still when he heard it. Not the theatrical stillness of a man performing composure, the actual stillness of a man who has just understood something he could not bring himself to believe before this moment. The system that he had bent and twisted and purchased for his entire adult life had, in this room, on this day, simply not bent. 1 week after the verdict, Judge Wilkerson sentenced Al Capone. The sentence was 11 years in federal prison, plus a $50,000 fine, over $1 million in today's money, plus $215,000 in back taxes, the amount the IRS had determined was owed, plus court costs of $30,000. It was the longest sentence for tax evasion that had ever been handed down in American history up to that point. Wilkerson had made a decision that was deliberately, pointedly exemplary. He was not just sentencing one man, he was making a statement about what the federal government intended to do with the era of gangster impunity. The sentence was the government saying, in the clearest possible terms, "This is over." Capone went to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1932. The initial years there were not as harsh as they should have been. His influence had not completely evaporated. He managed to secure certain privileges, maintain some contact with his organization, continue some level of communication with the criminal world he still, in theory, led. Federal officials monitoring the situation became increasingly concerned that the imprisonment was not having the effect they wanted. Capone, in Atlanta it appeared, was managing to be Capone with a minor change of address, so they moved him. In August 1934, Al Capone became prisoner number 85 at the newly opened federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz had been specifically designed to house the prisoners whose influence in other facilities had proven impossible to contain. It was on an island. It was surrounded by water so cold and currents so strong that swimming to shore was considered essentially impossible. In the entire history of the prison's operation, no prisoner who attempted it is confirmed to have survived. The guards could not be bribed, not because they were uniquely virtuous, but because the physical isolation of the facility made the normal mechanisms of corruption essentially impossible to operate. There was no way to get cash to a guard at Alcatraz without someone noticing. There was no way to send a message out, receive instructions in, maintain a criminal operation from a concrete cell on a rock in San Francisco Bay. Warden James Johnston ran Alcatraz with an emphasis on discipline that Capone had never experienced in his criminal career. No newspapers, limited mail, screened carefully, no contact with criminal associates, enforced silence during certain hours, hard labor. Capone worked in the laundry. The man who had ordered hundreds of murders, who had made $100 million a year, who had kept Chicago's entire political establishment on his payroll, he was now ironing shirts in a federal laundry for cents per hour. But the prison was not even the worst of what was happening to Al Capone in those years. The worst was happening inside him, had been happening invisibly for years. Al Capone had syphilis. He had almost certainly contracted it in the late 1920s from one of the prostitutes associated with his operations. A grim irony, given that his organization's prostitution business was one of its most profitable divisions. Syphilis in the pre-antibiotic era was a catastrophic diagnosis. It progressed through stages over years and decades, and in its late stages, it attacked the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. Late-stage neurosyphilis, as it was called, produced a range of neurological symptoms: memory loss, confusion, paranoia, personality changes, loss of fine motor control, and ultimately a form of dementia that could reduce an intelligent, functioning adult to a state of profound cognitive impairment. By the time Capone arrived at Alcatraz, the infection had probably been progressing for several years without treatment, either because he hadn't recognized the symptoms or because the available treatments at the time were themselves so toxic and uncertain that avoiding them seemed reasonable. The mercury and arsenic compounds that constituted the standard of care for syphilis in the early 1930s were nearly as dangerous as the disease. Penicillin, which would have cured him completely, would not be available until the 1940s. At Alcatraz, guards began noting changes. The prisoner, who had arrived as one of the most feared men in America, began exhibiting signs of confusion. He would forget what he was doing, mid-task. He would become agitated and disoriented in ways that seemed to have no immediate cause. His IQ, which had always been, whatever his formal education, genuinely above average, appeared to be declining. Other prisoners, with the casual cruelty that prison populations sometimes display, began to mock him. The man who had terrified Chicago, who had owned the police and the politicians and the judges, was becoming someone that his fellow prisoners made fun of. He was in his mid-30s. He was aging decades in months. When Al Capone went to prison in 1932, his organization did not collapse. Criminal organizations rarely collapse when their leaders are arrested. They are, by design, built with redundancy, with lieutenants who know how to operate the machinery. The man who took over day-to-day management was Frank Nitti, Frank the Enforcer Nitti, Capone's second-in-command, and the person who had kept the organization's discipline enforced through violence. Under Nitti, the Chicago outfit, as it was increasingly being called, continued operating through the early 1930s. But something fundamental changed in December 1933, and it changed the criminal economics of everything Capone had built so completely that the empire was never quite the same afterward. Prohibition ended. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and making alcohol legal again in the United States. The specific legal arrangement that had generated $100 million a year for the Chicago outfit, the supply of illegal alcohol to a market that had no legal alternative, ceased to exist overnight. Legitimate breweries and distilleries reopened. Legal bars and restaurants began selling alcohol again. The enormous profit margins of bootlegging, which existed specifically because the product was illegal and the market was therefore captive, disappeared along with the illegality. This was, purely from an economic standpoint, the more significant blow to Capone's empire than his imprisonment. The imprisonment removed the leader. The end of Prohibition removed the main revenue stream. The organization adapted, shifted more heavily into gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, the criminal activities that didn't depend on Prohibition, but it never regained the scale or the wealth of the bootlegging years. Those years were singular, specific to a particular combination of law and market that existed for 13 years and then was gone. Nitti continued running the outfit through the 1930s and into the early 1940s. He died in 1943, not at the hands of Eliot Ness or any federal agent, but by his own hand, shooting himself outside a Chicago courthouse when he faced federal prosecution on a labor racketeering charge. His suicide was a direct refutation of one of the movie's most memorable moments, and we will get to that in detail shortly. Al Capone was released from federal custody on November 16, 1939. He had served 7.5 years of his 11-year sentence, reduced for good behavior, and in recognition of his deteriorating health. He was 40 years old. He looked, by all accounts, much older. The syphilis had continued advancing throughout his prison years, and by the time he walked out of federal custody, his cognitive decline was visible to anyone who spent time with him. He had been declared, in a medical evaluation conducted before his release, to have the mental acuity of approximately a 12-year-old child. The man who had outmaneuvered Chicago's entire criminal and political establishment, who had built a $100 million empire from nothing, who had evaded prosecution for years through a combination of intelligence, money, and violence, he now struggled to follow conversations, to remember events, to function at the level that ordinary life requires. He went to his home on Palm Island in Miami, Florida, the mansion he had purchased in 1928 for $40,000, a property with a swimming pool and boat dock on Biscayne Bay that had been, in the 1920s, one of the most desirable addresses in Miami. May was there, Sonny was there. The family that Al had always, in his way, kept separate from his criminal life gathered around him. He lived quietly, fishing in his pool, sometimes believing, his attendants noted, that he was somewhere other than his backyard, receiving occasional visitors from his old world, men who came out of loyalty or sentiment and stayed for an afternoon before returning to lives that, unlike his, still had forward motion. He could not return to the crime business. He was not capable of it. The outfit that had been his no longer needed him or wanted the complications his presence would create. There were moments of lucidity. People who visited him in those years report occasional flashes of the man he had been, a sharp observation, a burst of laughter that sounded like the old Al, a comment that showed his intelligence had not completely abandoned him. These moments made what surrounded them more painful, not less. He had a stroke in January 1947. He developed pneumonia. On January 25th, 1947, Al Capone died at Palm Island, with May and Sonny present. He was 48 years old. The funeral was held on February 4th, 1947, in Chicago. A few hundred people attended, mostly family. The men who had once lined up to pay tribute to him, the police captains and the politicians and the criminal associates who had taken his bribes and his orders for decades, stayed away. Association with the dead Capone offered no benefits and carried only the risk of federal attention. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Chicago, in the family plot, under a simple headstone that reads, Alphonse Capone, 1899 to 1947. His estate, when probated, showed a man who had died essentially broke. Whatever had not been seized by the federal government in back taxes and fines had been spent or distributed or simply lost in the years of his decline. May Capone lived modestly until her own death in 1986. Sonny Capone, who had grown up in his father's shadow and spent his life trying to escape it, died in 2004. America's most famous gangster, the man who had made $100 million a year, ended with nothing. The empire was gone, the money was gone, the power was gone. What remained was a family doing their best to live ordinary lives and a historical record that would be systematically rewritten in the decades to come. Let me be clear about something before we start breaking down the movie. The Untouchables is a genuinely great film. Brian De Palma directed it in 1987 with the visual language of someone who had spent decades studying what cinematic violence and tension could look like when handled by a true craftsman. David Mamet wrote the screenplay with dialogue that is still being quoted nearly 40 years later. Robert De Niro's performance as Capone is one of the great performances of the 1980s. He captures the vanity, the volatility, the intelligence, and the menace of the man with a completeness that goes far beyond physical resemblance. Sean Connery won a well-deserved Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Kevin Costner anchors the film with a performance that is perhaps less celebrated, but is the right performance for the story the movie is telling. It is a great movie. Saying it is historically inaccurate is not saying it is bad. It is saying that it is a great film that chose drama over history at nearly every turn, and that the history it replaced was replaced so thoroughly that tens of millions of people came away from the experience with a fundamentally wrong understanding of what happened. With that established, let's give the film its genuine credit. Al Capone was real, obviously, and Robert De Niro's portrait of him captures something genuine, the combination of vanity and violence, the public performance of power, the way he could be charming and terrifying in the same moment, the flashy exterior concealing something darker and more calculating beneath. The film gets the texture of Capone's public persona right, even when it invents the specific incidents. Eliot Ness was real. The Untouchables team was real. They really did raid breweries. The movie accurately represents this aspect of the historical record, even if it exaggerates its importance. And the movie's portrayal of Ness as an honest man in a corrupt city is accurate in its essentials. His refusal to take bribes was real, it was documented, and it was genuinely unusual. The corruption of Chicago in the Prohibition era is one of the things the movie gets most right. The film's vision of a city where virtually everyone in authority is on the mob's payroll is historically accurate. The police took bribes, the politicians took bribes, the judges took bribes. The scene where Ness addresses a room of cops and asks which of them can be trusted, and only one man raises his hand. That may be dramatic invention in its specific staging, but it accurately represents the reality that honest law enforcement in Prohibition Chicago was vanishingly rare. The violence of Capone's era is depicted with accuracy in its scope and method. The gang wars were real. The drive-by shootings were real. The bombings were real. The casual availability of Thompson submachine guns, the Tommy gun, to organized crime was real. The movie captures the atmosphere of armed conflict that ran through the city for over a decade. Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion. The movie ends with this. And this is true. This is the one central historical fact that The Untouchables preserves. And it matters because everything else the film does serves to misrepresent how that tax evasion case came to exist. Now we get to the part that matters. Sean Connery's character, Officer Jim Malone, the tough, wise Irish-American beat cop who becomes Ness's mentor, his moral compass, his guide to the street reality of Chicago, and who dies in a brutally staged home invasion, is completely fictional. Entirely. There was no Jim Malone. There was no Irish cop who mentored Eliot Ness. There was no mentor figure at all. Ness built his team from his own research into available agents' records. The whole mentor-student relationship at the heart of the movie's emotional architecture is invented from beginning to end. Sean Connery won an Academy Award for playing someone who did not exist. This is not a small historical inaccuracy. In movies, the relationship between the protagonist and the mentor is often the engine of the entire emotional story. It's the relationship through which the protagonist changes, grows, learns what they need to know to face the final challenge. The Untouchables built its entire emotional engine on a fictional person, and because of that, the emotional resolution of the film, the mentor's death driving the hero to his final triumph, is also fictional. Ness was not driven to greater commitment by the murder of a friend. His friend didn't exist. Andy Garcia's character, George Stone, the rookie Italian-American marksman who joins the team and becomes its most skilled shooter, is mostly fictional as well. There was a real agent whose general background is sometimes cited as a loose inspiration, but the character as depicted, including the recruitment scene and everything that follows, is invention. The courtroom scenes. The Untouchables shows Ness dramatically discovering that Judge Wilkerson has been bribed, then improvising a solution by somehow getting the judge himself to recuse or switch. The details vary depending on which version you watch, in a moment of last-minute heroism that saves the case. This is wrong in almost every particular. Judge Wilkerson switched the jury, not himself. He was not bribed, he switched the jury specifically to prevent the jury from being bribed, and Ness was not in the courtroom. Ness had no role in the tax evasion trial. He did not gather the evidence. He did not testify. He was not a figure in the prosecution. The courtroom drama at the end of The Untouchables, which is the climax of the film's narrative, is fictional from beginning to end. Frank Nitti's death. In the movie's most dramatically memorable scene, the one that audiences have been quoting for nearly 4 decades, Elliot Ness throws Frank Nitti off the roof of the courthouse, sending him to his death on the pavement below. It's a shocking, cathartic, intentionally rule-breaking moment. Ness has stepped outside the law to deliver justice, and it is presented as the film's moral climax. Frank Nitti, as we have already established, died in 1943, 12 years after the Capone trial, by his own hand outside a Chicago courthouse after learning he faced federal prosecution for labor racketeering. Ness was not present. Ness did not kill Nitti. Nitti killed Nitti. The movie invented not just the manner of Nitty's death, but the entire scenario that surrounds it. The Canadian border shootout. One of the film's most exciting sequences involves Ness and his team intercepting a shipment of Capone's liquor at the Canadian border. A nighttime raid on a bridge, in the snow, gunfights, a bookkeeper captured who becomes a key witness against Capone. This never happened. The IRS did not find its evidence through dramatic raids at border crossings. It found its evidence through years of examining financial documents in non-dramatic office environments. There was no bookkeeper on a bridge in Canada. There was no dramatic border confrontation. There was Frank Wilson, alone in a room, reading ledgers. The baby carriage scene. The famous sequence in Union Station where Ness and his team engage in a slow-motion shootout while a baby carriage rolls down a grand staircase is one of the most visually celebrated moments in 1980s cinema. Brian De Palma has stated publicly that it is a direct homage to a scene in the 1925 silent film Battleship Potemkin. It has nothing to do with Al Capone, Eliot Ness, or anything that happened in Chicago in 1930. It is cinema, quoting, cinema, dressed in the costumes of history. The confrontations between Ness and Capone. The movie shows several scenes in which Ness and Capone face each other directly, in an elevator, in conversation, in the escalating mutual awareness of two men locked in a personal struggle. This serves the film's narrative perfectly, because great drama requires a personal conflict between protagonist and antagonist. But there is no credible historical evidence that Eliot Ness and Al Capone ever met. They moved in different circles, were being handled by different parts of the federal government, and the actual threat to Capone, the tax investigation, was so far from Ness's work that Capone's intelligence probably never identified Ness as a significant danger. Ness's central role in Capone's conviction. This is the foundational fiction on which the entire movie rests. The film presents Ness and his Untouchables as the people who brought down Capone, who gathered the evidence, who built the case, who put him away. The IRS agents who actually did this work, Frank Wilson, Elmer Irie, the team of investigators who spent years on financial records, appear in the film not at all, or in the most marginal capacity. The real heroes of this story are not in this movie. The person who gets the credit in this movie did not deserve it. Why did Ness's memoir create this fiction? The answer is both simple and sad. Eliot Ness wrote his memoir, The Untouchables, in 1957, the year he died. He was broke at the time. His later career had not fulfilled the early promise of his Chicago work. His term as Cleveland's safety director had been mixed, some genuine accomplishments, but also a notable failure in the investigation of the Cleveland torso murderer, a serial killer whose case he never solved. He had run for mayor of Cleveland and lost badly. He had tried several business ventures that had not succeeded. He died at 54 in relative obscurity and financial difficulty. His memoir was an attempt to reclaim the narrative of a career that had not turned out the way he had hoped. It was published after his death, which meant he never had to answer the historians and former colleagues who could have disputed its claims directly. And it worked. The memoir led to a television series in the late 1950s, and the television series led, eventually, to the 1987 movie, and the movie cemented a myth that still shapes public understanding of prohibition, organized crime, and American law enforcement. Ness was not a bad person. He was an honest federal agent who did his job with genuine commitment and personal courage. He deserves credit for what he actually did, building a team that couldn't be bribed, conducting raids that at least demonstrated that Capone could not operate with complete impunity, and representing a principle of honest law enforcement in a massively corrupt environment. These are real accomplishments. They are just not the accomplishment that mattered. To understand why The Untouchables is the movie it is, rather than the movie the history suggests it should be, you need to understand what movies are for and what they fundamentally cannot be. The true story of how Al Capone was brought down is a story about patient bureaucratic work. It is a story about one man spending 2 years in a room reading financial records. It is a story about an IRS intelligence unit applying tax law to criminal income. It is a story about the kind of unglamorous, methodical, evidence-gathering process that actually makes complex criminal cases. It is, in other words, a genuinely important and genuinely interesting story that has essentially no cinematic action in it whatsoever. Movies need protagonists with guns, or at minimum with some active physical engagement with the forces arrayed against them. Movies need a personal conflict at their center, a hero and a villain who are aware of each other, who affect each other, whose personal confrontation drives the narrative. Movies need dramatic scenes with clear stakes and visible, physical expression of those stakes. Movies cannot be 2 hours of an accountant reading ledgers, however important the ledgers. Hollywood looked at the true story of the Capone case and saw the problem immediately. The true hero, Frank Wilson, sat in a room and read documents. The true antagonist, Capone, had no idea Wilson existed until the indictment arrived. The true climax, a jury deliberation that produced a guilty verdict on accounting evidence, was as dramatic as watching paint dry compared to the conventions of the crime genre. And so David Mamet, one of the great screenwriters in American film history, did what screenwriters do. He found the parts of the story that had cinematic potential, the Ness raids, the corruption of Chicago, Capone's public flamboyance, the eventual tax conviction, and built around them a story that was internally coherent, dramatically satisfying, and historically quite wrong. He gave Ness a mentor to lose and a personal vendetta to pursue. He gave Capone a direct awareness of and hatred for Ness. He gave the audience the action scenes that the real history didn't contain. He made a great movie. The problem is that millions of people watched this great movie and came away with a firm, confident, completely wrong understanding of one of the most significant events in American legal history. The real heroes of the Capone case are not just unknown, they are actively erased by the fame of a narrative that never happened. Frank Wilson is not a household name. Elmer Eyre is not a household name. The patient, brilliant application of tax law to organized crime, which became a model for federal prosecution that was used for decades afterward, is credited in the public imagination to a man who had nothing to do with it. If the story of Al Capone's downfall has a hero, a single person whose intelligence, persistence, and skill made the critical difference, that person is Frank Wilson. Frank Wilson was 38 years old when he began the Capone investigation in 1929. He was an IRS special agent with a background in financial investigation, the kind of agent who was not glamorous, not quotable, not photographed, arriving at dramatic crime scenes. He was the kind of agent who sat down with a stack of documents and didn't get up until he understood everything in them. What Wilson did over the 2 years of his investigation was, in its way, one of the most impressive pieces of detective work in American law enforcement history. It just happened to look nothing like what detective work looks like in movies. He obtained every financial record that touched Al Capone's world. He analyzed them systematically, looking for the patterns that would allow him to reconstruct Capone's income in the legally provable terms that a federal tax case required. He tracked down witnesses who were justifiably terrified of cooperating with a federal investigation into Al Capone. He sat in locked rooms, alone, reviewing $5 million of transactions, looking for the thread. He found it, and the conviction that resulted from his work, the conviction that sent Capone to Alcatraz, set a precedent in American law enforcement that extended far beyond the Capone case. The strategy of using tax evasion charges to prosecute organized crime figures who had carefully insulated themselves from the direct evidence of their criminal activities became a fundamental tool of federal law enforcement. For decades after Capone, federal prosecutors used the same approach: follow the money, prove the income, prove the unpaid taxes against criminal organizations that had been otherwise prosecution-proof. Wilson's work didn't just get Capone. It created a method that got dozens of criminals who came after him. Frank Wilson went on to become the director of the United States Secret Service, serving in that role from 1936 to 1946. He was not famous, he did not write a self-promotional memoir, he did not have a movie made about him. He did his job, as he had always done his job, and he retired without ever having received the public recognition that his actual achievements warranted. Elmer Eyre, who headed the IRS intelligence unit and supervised Wilson's investigation, was similarly consequential and similarly uncelebrated. Eyre had the strategic vision to see that tax law was the key to Capone. The realization that the same financial lifestyle that was making Capone untouchable in Chicago's corrupted legal system was creating a documentary trail that federal tax investigators could follow. Eyre's application of financial intelligence techniques to organized crime was genuinely innovative, and its effects on American law enforcement extended decades beyond the Capone case. George E.Q. Johnson, the United States attorney who prosecuted Capone, presented the government's case in court with a clarity and precision that earned a conviction despite all the obstacles Capone's resources and organization threw in the path of justice. Johnson is at least marginally more famous than Wilson and Irie. He appears in some historical accounts, is sometimes mentioned in connection with the Capone case, but he remains far less celebrated than Eliot Ness, despite having contributed far more to the actual outcome. These are the people this story should be about. These are the names that should be on movie posters that children should learn in history class when the Prohibition era comes up. They are not famous. They never will be, probably. Hollywood chose Eliot Ness because Eliot Ness had guns and raids and newspaper photographs. Accountants with calculators will never be as cinematically compelling as federal agents with armored trucks. But if you leave this video with one thing, let it be their names. Frank Wilson, Elmer Irie, the men who actually brought down Al Capone. Eliot Ness deserves a fair accounting, not the hagiography of the movie, not the dismissal that sometimes comes as a reaction to that hagiography. Something in between, the actual man doing the actual job with the actual results. He was genuinely honest. In the specific context of Prohibition-era Chicago law enforcement, where honest agents were the rarest of exceptions, Ness's incorruptibility was a real and meaningful quality. His team, whoever exactly was on it and in whatever numbers, genuinely refused bribes in an environment where refusing bribes was professionally and sometimes physically dangerous. This mattered. It meant that Ness's investigations were clean, that the cases he made couldn't be thrown out on the grounds that his agents had been compromised, that there was at least one corner of Chicago's law enforcement apparatus that the criminal organizations hadn't purchased. He was personally brave. The raids he conducted involved real danger, real armed men protecting real criminal operations who had every reason to shoot their way out. Ness went first. He didn't send his team into situations he wasn't willing to enter himself. Whatever criticism historians level at his self-promotion and credit claiming, his personal courage during the raids is consistently attested and consistent with the record. He was very good at publicity, and while this became a liability when it shaped the public's misunderstanding of who deserved credit for the Capone conviction, it had some genuine value in the broader context of what the federal government was trying to accomplish in Chicago. Every brewery raid that made the front page of the Tribune was a demonstration that federal authority existed and would be exercised. Every photograph of destroyed equipment was a message to Chicago that the government was not entirely owned. In this limited sense, Ness's talent for managing the media served a purpose beyond his personal career advancement. What he was not was the hero of the Capone case. He did not lead the investigation that produced the conviction. He did not gather the tax evidence. He did not present the case in court. He was operating in a completely separate lane from the people who actually did these things, and the lanes never merged. The Capone that Ness was fighting, the bootlegger, the brewery owner, the supplier of speakeasies, was not the Capone that the IRS was going after. By the time Frank Wilson's tax case was building toward indictment, Ness's raids had already effectively ended with the close of the Prohibition Bureau's mandate. After Capone went to prison and Prohibition ended in 1933, Ness continued his law enforcement career. He became Cleveland's Director of Public Safety in 1935, a significant position that gave him oversight of both the police and fire departments. He did genuine good work there, reduced police corruption, modernized some operations, introduced investigative techniques that improved the department's capabilities. But he also failed publicly on the case that probably mattered most during his Cleveland years: the hunt for the Cleveland torso murderer, a serial killer who dismembered at least a dozen victims between 1935 and 1938. Ness never caught the killer. The case remains officially unsolved. It was the kind of open wound on a law enforcement career that cannot be entirely healed by other successes. He ran for Cleveland's mayoralty in 1947 and lost badly. He moved through a series of business ventures in the 1940s and 1950s, none of them successful. He died on May 16, 1957, in Crestline, Pennsylvania, where he was working for a company that manufactured a record storage product. He was 54 years old. He died, by most accounts, with financial difficulties and diminished prospects. His book, the memoir that would reshape his legacy, was published posthumously in October 1957 the same year he died. He never saw what his memoir became. Never saw the television series, never saw the movie, never lived to see Eliot Ness become one of the most celebrated law enforcement figures in American popular culture. There is something almost poignant about that, a man who spent his career managing his public image, who wrote a memoir specifically to reclaim the narrative of his legacy, who died before knowing whether it worked. It worked in ways he could not have imagined, and in ways that, historically, he didn't earn. The story of Al Capone is, at its foundation, a story about what happens when a government tries to legislate away human behavior that millions of people are determined to continue. And the lesson of Prohibition, if there is a single lesson, is so clear, so thoroughly documented, so uniformly agreed upon by historians across the political spectrum, that it should be impossible to forget. And yet its implications keep getting forgotten, in context after context, decade after decade. The people who pushed for Prohibition were not stupid. They were not malicious. Many of them were genuinely motivated by real suffering. The suffering of families where alcohol addiction had destroyed income and stability, the suffering of workers who spent their wages at saloons before bringing anything home. These were real problems. The intention behind Prohibition was to address real problems, but the analysis was wrong. The analysis assumed that what made alcohol harmful was its availability, and that removing its availability would remove the harm. What it actually did was transfer the entire alcohol industry from legal, taxed, regulated businesses to illegal, untaxed, unregulated criminal organizations. It did not reduce drinking. Studies of the period suggest alcohol consumption dropped by perhaps 10 to 20% at most, with most of the drop concentrated in the early years before illegal supply fully met demand. It did not reduce violence. It dramatically increased it, creating the gang wars that killed hundreds. It did not help families. It made the criminals who lived in those families' neighborhoods richer and more powerful. It did not improve civic institutions. It corrupted them at a scale that would take decades to begin repairing. What it did, with spectacular effectiveness, was create the conditions for the rise of organized crime in America. Before Prohibition, criminal organizations in American cities were small-scale, neighborhood-focused, and relatively contained. After 13 years of Prohibition, those organizations had been lavishly funded by alcohol profits, had used that funding to build the infrastructure of corruption, expand into new criminal markets, and establish the political and legal protection that made them nearly impossible to dislodge. The Chicago outfit, the New York families, the criminal organizations that would define American organized crime for the rest of the 20th century, they were built on the money that Prohibition put into criminal hands. Al Capone did not create himself. The United States government created him inadvertently through the 18th Amendment. It provided the business opportunity. It provided the market. It provided the enormous profit margins. It provided the corruption incentives by making the potential bribes so large that no honest policeman's salary could compete. It gave criminal organizations the resources to become institutions, and institutions survive the loss of any individual member. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the repeal came with a tacit acknowledgement that the experiment had failed. The 21st Amendment was the government saying, "We were wrong, this didn't work, we're undoing it." It was one of the most honest moments of national self-correction in American political history, and it came too late for the hundreds of people killed in Chicago's gang war, too late for the thousands poisoned by improperly made bootleg liquor, too late for the civic institutions that had been hollowed out by 2 decades of systematic bribery. The relevant question, the one that this history keeps raising, is whether the pattern that Prohibition demonstrated can be recognized in other contexts. Whether the mechanism that creates criminals, prohibiting something people want so intensely that they will break any law to get it, thereby creating a captive market of enormous value for whoever is willing to supply it illegally, has applications beyond alcohol. History's answer to that question is uncomfortable, and the history of American drug policy in the decades following Prohibition suggests that the lesson of 1920 to 1933 was not as thoroughly learned as the repeal of the 18th Amendment might have implied. But that is a subject for another video. What matters for this story is what Prohibition meant for Al Capone specifically. Without Prohibition, Al Capone is a local criminal in Brooklyn or Chicago, making a decent criminal living from gambling and prostitution, never becoming famous, never becoming powerful enough to require the attention of the federal government. With Prohibition, he becomes a figure in American history, a household name a century after his birth, the subject of movies and books and this video. Prohibition didn't just make him rich, it made him into something that transcended his individual criminal career. He became the symbol of an era that began with an idealistic attempt to improve American society and ended with the most powerful criminal organization the country had yet seen. Let me bring this entire story together from the beginning to the end so you can see it whole. January 17th, 1899. A boy is born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants. He grows up poor, drops out of school at 14, falls in with the 5 Points gang, learns his criminal trade from one of the best criminal minds of the era, and gets on a train to Chicago in 1920 with nothing but ambition and the education that the streets of Brooklyn had given him. He arrives in Chicago at the exact moment that the United States government, through an act of spectacular policy miscalculation, has handed the criminal world the greatest business opportunity in American history. He takes that opportunity. He builds it, methodically and brilliantly and with a ruthlessness that cost hundreds of people their lives, into a $100 million criminal empire that controls a major American city more completely than most governments control their countries. He orders the St. Valentine's Day massacre and kills 7 men while his main target walks away. He attracts the attention of the federal government at a level that makes his downfall inevitable. And then, while a publicity-seeking Prohibition agent is raiding breweries and calling newspapers to photograph the wreckage, a quiet IRS accountant named Frank Wilson sits in a locked room and reads ledgers for 2 years and builds a case that is unbeatable. October 1931. Al Capone, age 32, is convicted of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years, sent to Atlanta, transferred to Alcatraz. His brain, silently destroyed by a disease he contracted through his own criminal enterprises, reduces the most feared man in America to a confused old man who fishes in his backyard pool and doesn't always know where he is. Released in 1939. Dead in 1947, age 48, broke, forgotten by the organization he built. The movie gave Eliot Ness the credit. History gives it to Frank Wilson and Elmer Eyre and George E.Q. Johnson. The men with the guns became famous. The men with the calculators changed American law enforcement. Hollywood told you, brave federal agent defeats powerful gangster. History tells you, patient accountant applies tax law to criminal income. Hollywood told you, this is a story about guns and raids and personal courage. History tells you, this is a story about the IRS and 2 years of financial records. Hollywood told you, the hero had a name you already know. History tells you, the hero had a name you've never heard. The movie is better drama. The history is better truth. And the truth that the most feared criminal in American history was brought down not by gunfights, but by a tax form. Not by a hero, but by an accountant. Not by Hollywood, but by the Internal Revenue Service, is somehow stranger, funnier, more ironic, and more genuinely interesting than anything Brian De Palma invented. Al Capone made $100 million a year. He owned Chicago, he outlasted rivals, survived assassination attempts, bought off the entire legal establishment of a major American city. He was, in his terrible way, one of the most capable operators of his era. And he went to prison because he forgot to pay his taxes. That's the real story. That's what the movie didn't tell you. If you just watched this, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of deep research that takes serious time to put together, and the fact that you stayed for all of it means more than a like or a comment, though I'll take both. Subscribe right now, hit that button, and turn on notifications. This is part of my series on the real stories behind famous movies. I've done Whitey Bulger, Barry Seal, and now Al Capone. Next up, I'm going after another beloved movie that got the history completely wrong in ways that will genuinely change how you see it. You do not want to miss that one. Like this video right now if you haven't already, that deserves a thumbs up. It also tells YouTube that this is the kind of content worth putting in front of more people, and the story of what really happened with Al Capone deserves to be as widely known as the Hollywood version. Comment below with 3 things. First, did you know before this video that it was the IRS and not Eliot Ness who brought down Capone? Genuinely curious how many people already knew this. Second, what surprised you most about the real story? Third, Do you think Hollywood has a responsibility to be historically accurate, or does the quality of the drama justify the historical lies? And share this video. Share it with anyone you know who loves the Untouchables. Share it with anyone who thinks they know the Al Capone story, because the gap between what the movie told 50 million people and what the historical record actually shows is the kind of gap that matters. Not because the movie is bad, it isn't, but because the truth is worth knowing alongside it. Kevin Costner made Eliot Ness look like the hero who changed American history. Robert De Niro made Al Capone look like an unstoppable force that required a hero to defeat. The truth is simpler and stranger. An IRS accountant with a calculator and 2 years of patience did what raids and gunfights couldn't. He followed the money. He proved the taxes weren't paid. He put the most powerful gangster in America in a federal prison. Sometimes the boring thing is the important. Sometimes the person nobody's heard of is the person who changed everything. Sometimes the truth is more interesting than the movie. Hollywood gave you the myth. This video gave you the history. Al Capone was brought down by the IRS. Frank Wilson is the name you should know. And next time you watch The Untouchables, and watch it, it really is a great film. You'll watch it knowing what it got right, what it invented, and who the real Untouchables were. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.